the story, just in closing, yesterday we talked about this infamous location called Watergate. And while there have been many scandals in our country's history, if you think about Credit Mobilier, right? Or you think about the entire Grant administration, it seemed, or certainly later in history when you had Warren Harding's presidency with Teapot Dome. Yeah, good. So yeah, right. You get the idea that scandals have occurred for administrations, but historically, you never ran into such open hostility towards the investigation of a scandal. Now, that has happened in recent years where we have seen, presidents not be responsive to investigations, but never in the history of our country have we seen what took place under President Nixon. And I hope we don't see it again. And I've kind of given you this picture of Nixon as not a bad president. He was a fairly moderate to liberal, even social policy president, somewhat hawkish, who ended our presence in Vietnam and helped negotiate this thing called détente. But throughout the entire presidency of Nixon and Kennedy and Johnson and Eisenhower, I mentioned this cartoonist the other day, and I say this because his cartoons are almost ubiquitous with AP textbooks. Like, you're going to see Herb Block, right? Here's 1973 Herb Block. And man, he had so much room for entertainment and commentary with Nixon. So these are a couple Herb Block cartoons. He was most noted in the Washington Post. That was one of his, he was syndicated, so he would appear in other newspapers, but particularly in the Post. So here you see Nixon sort of hiding behind an American flag, and there's bags of cash and safes and tape recorders down here. And you see words like Mexico with money and faked cables. And so this information was so complicated. It was even hard to distill it into a cartoon. I mean, you look at this cartoon is pretty complicated looking, right? Here you see the American privacy, and it's wrapped in a U.S. enforcement officer has got tape recording it. And so a lot of what you're going to see during this period are the tapes. That was the phrase you would hear. And of course, that's the U.S. government did spy on Americans during the Nixon presidency. And it did under the Johnson presidency, but it didn't really come out during his presidency. Here you see the war in Vietnam. Again, Herb Block commenting on that secret election year plan to end the war, which of course was just to bomb the war into Vietnam particularly. And here you see another safe with the guy holding it on his back and another guy holding it on his back. And if you'll notice, they say investigator. So here's the investigator dressed like crooks, right? Toting tons of money. And the number one crook in the front, if you can tell, is President Nixon, right? So this is the kind of stuff that the political cartoonists had a field day with. And the American people, like in recent years, some Americans did not believe it, like utterly were like, no way President Nixon did this, he's a decent guy. And this is just, the media, and particularly the media of the Washington Post. So before we get into what actually happened, I want to explain how this becomes public life. So when we talk about the media, and you may consider the media annoying at times, but without the media, information just doesn't get out to the public. It just doesn't. The government decides what it wants to give you, and that's called propaganda. So when the break-in occurs, there are 5 burglars arrested. So you have these 5 guys in the Democratic National Committee's offices. They are actually ex-CIA guys, but what they've done is they've propped a door so that it won't lock behind them. And a security guard finds that. Forrest Gump doesn't bust the Watergate burglars. He doesn't call it in. But this guard, this guy's job is to walk around. He notices that a door's propped. So then he starts investigating like more closely, and he's walking through these offices, and he finds these grown men like huddled under a desk, like hiding behind a desk. And he's like, okay, they broke in. They're burglars. They broke in, and it's the Democratic National Committee. Is the headquarters of that party. And so they're like, why would people break into the Democrat? Like, there's nothing much to steal there, really, except for political information. And so the story breaks when this man, Bob Woodward, you see him here. Bob Woodward, at the time, worked for the Washington Post, and he covered local news stories. You understand? Like Washington, D.C. courtroom stories. So he didn't like that assignment. It was kind of boring. this would be like typical, what crime happened in Washington, D.C. yesterday. And so he's there, and these five guys are in first of all, they're like white guys who look sort of middle class, and they've been arrested for burglary. And so he's like, okay, that's odd. And then they have this really high dollar lawyer representing them, like this very important lawyer. And so he asks the lawyer, like, who are you? Who's paid you to represent these people? Like, you're not a court defender. Like, who are you? And the guy won't talk to him. The lawyer won't. And so he's going to start doing some digging, and he discovers, Woodward does with the policeman, he discovers that when they searched these five guys, one of them had a contact card, like a card with a number on it, and the number was to a phone number in the White House. Okay, like an office phone number in the White House. And so he starts digging, and the office that is connected to is the office of the Attorney General. And so now he's really curious. And so this is going to be a 2.5-year investigation by the Washington Post before Congress really seriously gets involved. Okay, 1.5 to 2 years. So this is why we have these big newspaper companies, so that they'll pay for in-depth study and reporting. Because if these guys didn't do this, it's highly probable that no one would have ever heard about it, other than, these guys got arrested and then got off, so to speak. So he starts to dig, and that prompts the U.S. Senate to start holding a committee hearing. Okay, and so the senator in charge of the committee hearings is Senator Sam Ervin from North Carolina. Okay, he's an old school, like, conservative Democrat, and he's the senator who investigated. Over in the House, they're also going to start an investigation, and they're going to start bringing White House employees to Congress to testify. Okay, and initially, not a whole lot is kind of coming forth, like not much is forthcoming. The two chief advisors to the president are kind of mum, Haldeman and Ehrlichman. They don't say anything. And then this guy, John Dean, does the unbelievable. He's the White House lawyer. He was hired by the Attorney General, who he'd known, John Mitchell. And John Dean says, yes, President Nixon knew about the break-in and is involved in a cover-up of the break-in. Now, people are like, what? Like, that was kind of like a bombshell. Like, the thought was like Watergate was having to do with some functionaries in the Republican Party, right? Well, it turned out that Dean basically alleges that the President of the United States and the Chief Law Enforcement Officer of the United States, the Attorney General, are covering up and involved directly with this break-in. Now, it just so happens that the Attorney General was also the chair of the Committee to Re-elect the President. All right, yeah, and so the committee, I have a Committee to Re-elect the President button in here somewhere, and it has that certainly memorable name, CREEP, right? So the Committee to Re-elect President Nixon is called CREEP. Here it is. This is Young Voters for the Committee to Re-elect. All right, it's like a button from the campaign, of '72. Now, keep in mind, all of this is happening in the year that Nixon wins the biggest election in history up to that point, right? So Mitchell, they do more digging, and it comes to find out that Dean tells them. So Dean is like what we would call whistleblower. John Dean is the guy who tells the secrets. And he says there was a safe in Attorney General's office where cash was stored, like piles of cash, which was then given to the plumbers. And so this is kind of the first time the idea of the plumbers comes to light. And so these are the two leading plumbers, Hunt and Liddy, who were arrested, right? Both of which had background in clandestine operations, looked like the CIA. All right. Liddy was involved in the overthrow of Guatemala, for example. So these guys are ex-CIA, okay, and these are two of the burglars. And Dean is saying that this guy, Mitchell, as well as the other president's men, are involved in covering up the White House's connection to the burglary. But of course, he could very well be lying, right? I mean, he is. It's he said here in this case. Then comes the super bombshell that a guy named Alexander Butterfield tells the investigation, the Watergate investigation. Oh, by the way, the president records everything they say in the White House and on the phone. It started under Johnson, and I mentioned this the other day, and I forgot to mention, Johnson really didn't start this to blackmail people. Johnson started it for history, so that historians would have actual record of what was said in the White House, so you could have like the verbal history of the presidency. Well, man, this is going to come back to haunt Nixon, because Nixon has recorded everything basically that's been a conversation in the White House. So when Butterfield says, "Oh yeah, we have this taping thing," and he himself doesn't testify to what Nixon has said, but he says, there are these tapes that should cover these meetings. All right, and Dean corroborates it, saying, hey, there should be on the tapes evidence of President Nixon telling these people to cover up, and beyond even that, involving the CIA and the FBI and obstructing the investigation. So he's actually like calling up the FBI director and telling him, you got to make sure this thing goes away. So that is absolutely guilty, we would say, of obstruction of justice. It's a huge biggie, right? So at this point, the public then demands, and the Congress demands, we'll turn over the tapes. Okay. So Nixon says, nope, not going to do it. Right. I'm going to take executive privilege, that old idea. And it's going to go all the way to the Supreme Court, Nixon versus United States, right? And they're going to demand that Nixon turn over the tapes because executive privilege can't be claimed in a criminal investigation. In other words, this is an investigation of wrongdoing by the executive office. Now, throughout this whole period, Nixon is denying. Like, I am not a crook. Your president is not a crook. I haven't done any of this stuff. And so he decides under really, he's not a fan of it, but ultimately the attorney general will appoint a special prosecutor to be like an investigator of the incident, knowing full well that Mitchell, is responsible. Like Mitchell was the lead dude on getting the money to these guys, like paying for the plumbers unit. So the investigation goes forward, and as they're looking at the tapes, they're like, wait a minute, there's missing tapes. Like there's certain tapes that aren't there that should be there. Now, also, by the way, folks, this stuff will be like publicized, and it comes to light that Nixon has racist, views. He says some really ugly things there. Yeah. He uses expletives like F words and just F bombs all the time, right, kind of thing. There's certain parts of the tape that's explicit. Yeah, expletive removed, right? So at this point, Nixon is told by Congress, you need to turn over the missing tapes. And Nixon again kind of reluctantly says, no, I'm not going to do that. And it looks like they're going to prosecute again, like demand that he do it. And he finally turns over what history now calls the smoking gun tape. And in the smoking gun tape, which is only a few minutes out of all the tapes, it does involve Nixon directly talking about covering up the investigation. So here you have on tape Nixon being guilty, and that was huge because up until this point, it would kind of been like, yeah, these people all the president's men have done criminal activity, but not the president himself. Like these guys around him have been involved in this to try to get him reelected. But unfortunately, in the midst of all this, it gets even crazier. The vice president of the United States has to resign because the state of Maryland, he used to be the governor of Maryland. Right. And he took kickbacks from a construction company. While he was governor, he allowed the companies that would get government contracts to give him money or to funnel money to his campaigns. And so Spiro Agnew is his name. And ironically, he was on the ticket because he was known to be tough on crime, right? The law and order governor. And so he is going to resign, quit. And President Nixon will appoint the House Minority Leader, who was an important guy. Gerald Ford is from Michigan, and he was, a very popular guy and known to not be like grotesquely partisan or, in other words, he was like so squeaky clean, the Congress would approve his appointment. All right. So Nixon picks Ford, and Ford comes in, and here's another cartoon saying maybe one day you'll have your own number two man to smear people, right? By the way, the plumbers are also admit to breaking into Ellsberg psychiatric doctor's office. Yeah. So this is that list of things, and it comes to light during the investigation that Nixon and the plumbers have carried out what he would have called dirty tricks. So they would, for example, forge documents and then get police to investigate alleged crimes that were forgeries, right? So they'd set people up for life of being burdensome. If you're on the enemies list, he would have the IRS audit you. Now, guys, the IRS, the Justice Department, these are America's agencies. They're not supposed to be used as like political pawns to attack political enemies. Like that's absolutely not their function. So the one of the biggest components, I think, is the use of the FBI and the CIA to obstruct the investigation. Like he actually told them, like prevent information from flowing. And, you know, you could just tell here that the noose was closing in, so to speak. And by this point, most of his advisors have either resigned or been charged with crimes and have been fired. You know, so Mitchell is going to go to jail. The Attorney General of the United States is going to go to jail. Alderman and Ehrlichman, they're going to have. I don't think they do much jail time, but they're going to be convicted of crimes. All of the major advisors to Chuck Colson are going to be convicted. And in the investigation of those people, the special prosecutor uses the language "an unindicted co-conspirator," meaning there's someone we're not indicting, who we're not naming, right? But he also participated in this. And, you know, pretty much everybody in America realizes that it's the President of the United States is the unindicted co-conspirator. So when it looks like Cox, and Archibald Cox is the special prosecutor. He is a figure who was appointed by John Mitchell to investigate Watergate. So when it looks like Cox is going to get the kind of stuff that he wants, Nixon orders the Attorney General, the new Attorney General, to fire Archibald Cox, right? So that Attorney General and the Deputy Attorney General both quit and protest. They will not fire Cox. So finally, it's the third guy down in the Justice Department, who will later be, a Supreme Court justice, or nominee, and he fires Archibald Cox. Okay, and so with Cox's firing, you have no more independent prosecutor. So critics of that action called it the Saturday Night Massacre, when the special prosecutor, the new Attorney General, and the Deputy Attorney General all are out, like at one time. So know the Saturday Night Massacre, which is when Nixon overtly obstructs the investigation, right? So with that, the House begins to draw up articles of impeachment. They have 3 charges against the president. The biggest and most effective charge is obstruction of justice. It is very clear that President Nixon has used his power to stop people from being able to investigate this crime. So he's obstruction of justice, abuse of power, meaning using his office in a manner that is not what was intended at all, like abusing it, and contempt of Congress. And so this is for his repeated use of executive privilege, not turning over the tapes. And at that point, so it's in August of '74, that summer, a group of Republican senators led by Barry Goldwater, remember Goldwater, come to the White House and they say, Mr. President, you are taking the Republican Party down. You're destroying, the credibility of us and your government. And we urge you to resign. Now, throughout this whole investigation, Nixon said, I will not resign. I've not done anything wrong. I'm not a crook. But when he saw that the Republicans in the Senate, now keep in mind, if there is an impeachment, it is the Senate who will determine his guilt or innocence, right? And they're like, we're not with you, dude. We are not on your team. Right? We're not going to go forward with this. So when he hears that, he's like, so this is what he submits. This is the entire note. So he submits a letter to Secretary of State Kissinger. That's who it's supposed to go to. And it says, I hereby resign the office of President of the United States. That's it. That's all. So the president just sends a 1-sentence letter to Secretary Kissinger, and that's it. He quits being president. And so this picture is from him, walking over to his chopper, and that's kind of like his last D for Nixon as he gets ready to fly away in Marine One. So with that, Nixon will move back to California, and he will ultimately get sort of it's an interesting movie about this event. During an interview, a couple of years later, he's going to be interviewed by an English sort of like pop culture journalist, a guy like you might think of like Entertainment Tonight or People Magazine kind of journalism, And this guy, David Frost, is given an interview with Richard Nixon, like a face-to-face interview with him. And so for 3 days, they conduct this interview. And finally, on the 3rd day, it's about Watergate. And Nixon, finally comes as close as he ever had to accepting that he was guilty of doing the Watergate wrongs, and that his one major apology kind of that he makes. So that's what everybody wants to hear. They want to hear that he's sorry. He says he's sorry that he put the American people through it. like the American people went through this, but he's very reluctant to accept any kind of responsibility or guilt for this, even years later. In subsequent years, in the 80s and 90s, Nixon will be routinely asked about foreign policy. So he will later become sort of like a respected, like the Watergate stuff will start to fade, and his strength in foreign policy will become the subject of books and things like that. But Watergate will be one of the most lasting, I think, scandals on our presidency, because in it we now are no longer trustful that the president is the president for all Americans, and we start to have this idea that the president is out to get us potentially. I mean, this guy had enemies lists of American citizens, and was using the tools of government to harm them. And that was a really eye-opener for us. So be sure you know that. Now, the book is going to ask you about the idea of impeachment. And I think the beauty of this is he wasn't impeached, right? But the wheels of justice did turn, in a sense that Nixon will forever be associated with scandal. And that shows if he had done the right thing and not engaged in either the cover-up or having money sent to the plumbers, then he would have gotten out of it. I think he would easily have survived this and probably had a decent reputation as a result of it. But no, he didn't do that. So with his resignation, we're going to move into a new period of history. Now, I meant to do this before Watergate, but I'll tell you what, let's come back to this a little bit later. I know we did this once already, but I want to touch on it once again. Maybe, sorry. Put it right there for the ladies. So with that, Gerald Ford becomes president. And you need to let that sink in, because Gerald Ford is the only person in American history to not be elected to the office of vice president or president. So in other words, he was appointed to fill the office of vice president. No one voted for that other than the good people of Michigan's 5th district or 8th district or whatever district he was from. I mean, he was a congressman, right? So he did represent somebody officially. And, he was an important Republican leader. But when he came in, he said, my fellow Americans, our long national nightmare is over. And that kind of thing stuck, a little bit with the American public. Like, oh, is it? Okay. Because what we were facing, and this will always be one of the most controversial decisions of any president, was an actual criminal prosecution of a former American president. And, Nixon should have been indicted and tried, I think, for crime. But Ford has a very good argument. He believes that there are a lot of bad things going on in the world in 1974. And if we put all of our energy as a nation on this trial of President Nixon, which is what a lot of people wanted, then we won't make any progress on anything else. Like the whole nation will just grind to a halt. And we were facing economic problems. There were foreign policy issues. So Nixon is going to have a blanket pardon by Gerald Ford. He pardons him for all crimes that he either has done or might have done. But pretty much that's like, they would call it a blanket pardon. Like it pardons everything. So Nixon will not be prosecuted at all. And there are a lot of people who are unhappy about this. When Ford does that, there are a lot of people who are angry. Now, here's Ford's background. Ford is our only major athlete to serve as president. Now, Teddy Roosevelt was certainly athletic. President Obama was relatively athletic, but Jerry Ford was a football star at the University of Michigan. So if you know anything about football, Michigan is like a major powerhouse in football. And this guy was a starter on a D1 athlete school, So he went on to the Navy, and he was a hero in the Navy. He served with distinction. And then he came back and had been serving multiple terms in the House. And like I said, he was the House minority leader. Like he was the top Republican in the House. And that he was on the Warren Commission as well. So Ford had great credentials. However, he was the only president ever to not be elected to either of those offices. Okay, so I would definitely be familiar with that. Now, when he came into office, the thing that I will always remember about Ford is as early as I could. My aunt and uncle were in their 20s when I was this age, and I would go stay with them, and they watched Saturday Night Live. Now, Saturday Night Live debuted, I want to say, in '74, right around that year. I can double check, but you guys know Saturday Night Live. So Saturday Night Live debuts, and initially the cast was sort of a variety of players, but pretty quickly on, it started in '75. Yeah, first episode was in '75, so right around that period. So one of the actors on it was an actor named Chevy Chase. All right, you may have heard of him. And Ford, now reminder, D1 athlete, University of Michigan, right? Now here's LBJ cracking on Jerry Ford saying, problem with Ford is that he used to play football without a helmet. All right, so there's this impression of Ford being, because he was an athlete, being kind of dumb, which is absolutely not true, but that was kind of the association. But the irony is the sort of pop culture history of Jerry Ford is this picture on top. And what you're looking at is Ford fell down these stairs at Air Force One, like, on camera. He fell like down the stairs and landed. And photographers got a picture of it. And now, Biden fell down the stairs the other day on Air Force One. I mean, this happens. But Biden's like 80, so here's Jerry Ford tripping and falling. And they played this over and over again. I mean, I'm talking about and Saturday Night Live, Chevy Chase played the role of Gerald Ford. And so every time he did anything, he would make a bumbling mess of it. If he had to answer the phone, and the phone went flying everywhere. He was decorating the Christmas tree and he fell over and the whole tree fell down. So a lot of this kind of humor. And that image stuck more than like the reality of Ford, the athlete and smart guy did. Here you can see President Ford with Chevy Chase at a Ford rally, so that's kind of ironic, I suppose. So under President Ford, through his first 2.5 years, he's basically going to maintain détente. Now, you guys remember what détente is, right? You got to learn this word, guys. If you know anything else about Nixon and Ford, you got to know détente. And that is kind of relaxing the tensions between the U.S. and Soviet Union. It's getting along with it. So ABM treaty, SALT treaty, grain deal to the Soviet Union, that's the kind of stuff. And détente was very much the 60s and 70s, late 60s and 70s, okay? Brezhnev is their leader. And so Ford is going to continue détente in Finland, Helsinki, Finland. Yeah. And so he and 34 other countries, especially the Soviet Union, they're going to send representatives to Helsinki. So it's basically like a combo of NATO and the Warsaw Pact. They meet together, which is crazy. You think about it, like NATO and the Warsaw Pact. And the Soviets guarantee that they will begin protecting human rights. All right. And they didn't. Okay. So the key thing here is a human rights guarantee. Now, they also confirmed some boundaries, like border settlements and stuff. But at the end of the day, you had a group in the Soviet Union who were strongly opposed to, communism and to the Soviet brutality, right? This regular Soviet treatment. And we call these people dissidents, D-I-S-S-I-D-E-N-Ts. And the dissidents were routinely rounded up and thrown to prison, okay? So this was supposed to make life better. Like they weren't going to be throwing free speech people in prison. Well, they kept doing that. And so with that, Ford is in his last year of the presidency going to abandon détente. Now, the president who's most famous with kicking détente to the curb is President Reagan. Reagan is going to openly speak out against détente, reject détente, okay? But, that was a period. So what's wrong with détente? I guess the easiest way to put it is that the Soviets weren't doing their part. We were giving them or selling and trading with them food and technology, and, they weren't making any sort of concessions within the Soviet Union to liberalize. It is a one-way street, absolutely. And so particularly the Soviets were locking up famous dissidents. This guy Solzhenitsyn and Sakharov, they were world famous. We're talking about known commonly in America. And because they kept locking these guys up, we were less enthusiastic of it. And perhaps most notably is it really did divide the Republican Party. So your kind of traditional Rockefeller Republicans were more détente-ish, your Nixons and Kissingers. But your Goldwaters and your Reagans were much more hawkish on the Soviet Union. They never considered trading and talking and get along with an evil empire as something that we should do. So this is ultimately going to lead to a kind of split in the Republic. Well, not just this, some Republicans, moderate Republicans, are still large social programs in the 70s, Nixon included, but that's definitely going to make the difference. So in 75, the war in Vietnam ends with the fall of Saigon, right? Ford actually asked Congress for permission for money and potentially send troops over there. Congress is we're not having it. We're done over there. Yeah, we're not gonna go there, bud. So that will bring it in. You know, we're perceived, and these are those refugees I was talking about the other day, the ones that went by water, the boat people. Here you can see people trying to escape by land. Showed you the famous chopper footage, right, when the embassy gets overrun. Yeah, right. It's crazy, isn't it? Yeah, so that's this year. That's the year of Ford's presidency, 75, right? And this is what I went over the other day, but I thought I'd go over it with you again when it comes to stagflation, right? That term, that new concept that never has happened in history before. Okay, this was the first time we'd ever seen it as a nation, this economic problem. So when I have on here, what do economists list? You guys ever been to like a fast food restaurant? You probably recognize that most people working there are either teenagers or women, right? Well, that started in the 70s, where you saw a lot more low-skilled jobs, and that would see the whole reason for child labor throughout all of history is that it depressed wages and kept them cheap, and so it's easier to operate like cost. Men are going to demand more money, right? So you don't see too many grown men working at Chick-fil-A. You know, maybe they're driving the truck that carries the stuff to Chick-fil-A, but they're probably not running up a cash register, right? And even in the 70s, well, heck, even today, a lot of time men are expected to be the breadwinners. So they're not going to work for $7, $8 an hour now, right? So this was pretty common to see a lot of women and children enter the workforce that were low skills. But I think one of the biggest problems, I have it on here as a decline in the competitive advantage. So why was there a decline in competitive advantage? Because Americans stopped investing the way they should have. I showed y'all the other day the beautiful 66 Mustang, right? The problem is that we weren't investing in the types of sector of the economy that we needed new investment in. So in many ways, Ford, IBM, some of the big companies were kind of like operating a decade earlier. And, you know, we had lost sort of our hunger. America had become now the strongest country in the world for 2 decades, right? And so when kids grew up and went to college or high school, they didn't really feel like they had to do that well, because working, like taking it easy, still got you a decent income. You know, like not graduating high school still got you a relatively decent income. And so we hit a period in American history where we stopped being as productive. And I think it's because we were fat and lazy. And not literally, although now literally I would say that. But then it was a sign of affluence, where once you're on top, if you don't keep working to do what got you on top, you'll stop being on top. Right. And so we were on top for a long time, and we were hungry. You know, like people really were aggressively trying to be successful, and then we weren't. And so that's the 70s. In a lot of ways, it's a period where it's hard to explain exactly what's singular. It's not a singular. It's a whole group of things. So the Vietnam War, we talked about the cost of the Vietnam War, right? So the Vietnam War was overwhelmingly inflationary, because when the government procures helicopters, let's say they're going to buy some Hueys, and, you know, I don't know whatever a helicopter costs, but let's do some math here, some accounting statistics. So what was that? The Sikorsky, what was the Huey helicopter's actual call? You remember the call letters? Bell UH-1 Iroquois. All right. So the Bell helicopter UH-1, Bell UH-1 Iroquois cost, they're for sale. So it cost $4.7 million. All right. And let's see how many Hueys downed in Vietnam, shot down in Vietnam. According to the Pilots Association, a total of 11,846 helicopters were shot down. Each one cost $4.7 million. So you can start adding the zeros to that, right? I mean, we're going to pour billions of dollars down a black hole in Vietnam, right? And in the end, you know, every time we spend $4.7 million on a Huey, there are 11,000 of them, so whatever the choppers are, that means that the government is taking money, putting it into circulation, but not producing a good and service that will be used by people in circulation. So in other words, that money is basically just going into the economy, right? But no supply of stuff. It's not like you're going to stay in a Huey helicopter for, you know, your house or for, you know, your vehicle. So there's that, and then there's all this great society spending. right? Which is billions and billions of dollars, where you're getting a check from the government basically for doing nothing. You're not doing anything. You're not making a good or service. You're just getting money. And you're supposed to use that to buy food, right? But you're not producing anything with it. You yourself aren't. So all that means is there's a whole lot of money pouring into circulation, but people aren't working as much. And that's absolutely the worst thing you want to see happen, because that means inflation shoots up and then we have a recession. So economists didn't believe you could have inflation and a recession. Like that can't really work on the supply curve. Like you can't have too much money and no one working, right? Except here we had all this money circulating and unemployment was going up, and we didn't know how to get out of it. And so throughout President Ford and Carter's administration, you're going to come up with a major problem called inflation. And to be fair, Ford's solution for it is really not very good. Let me show you what was the solution. All right. So the solution for how to combat inflation was to have a slogan to combat inflation. So this is what it looked like. Like we actually had people in America wearing buttons. This is a White House like project, right? So, help your country and help yourself with inflation, as if that was like something we could just will ourselves to do. Like, oh yes, I'll be glad. How do I stop inflation though? Like that was the key, right? So frequently this was lampooned as being totally ineffective. Like you can't beat inflation with like slogans, like, hey, we're gonna beat inflation. Yeah, exactly. So I guess my point is that the economists of the day knew that to beat inflation was going to require really some heavy sacrifice. I can't get that to work. So I do want you to understand that this was the idea. Oh, what is that? Look at that. I hadn't seen this. Check it out. It is. It is a Pizza Hut. Look at this. This is a fight inflation now at your Pizza Hut. Buy one pizza, get the second one free with a coupon, right? So that was how we were going to fight inflation. Is we we're all going to team up together. And guys, you can't beat inflation on the consumer side. Who's responsible for whipping inflation? Central banks. Like this is a bank issue. This is a Federal Reserve issue. And so the Federal Reserve is not going to do what they're supposed to during President Ford's presidency, which is how do you stop inflation if you're the Federal Reserve? Oh, wow. Yeah, it's exactly what you do. Very good. Like you raise interest rates. The problem is interest rates weren't that high. And I know you're like, well, that's a good thing, right? Well, if you want to stop inflation, you're going to have enormously high interest rates. So let me look at the interest rates in the 70s. Okay. So interest rates in the 70s. Yeah, I know, man, no doubt. So yeah, you're going to see that, but that's not even the highest though. It's going to get higher than that. Oh no, not that high. All right. So let me show y'all what he's saying. Whoa, to. Okay. So interest rates are going to rise dramatically, and that means Keynesian economics is out the window. So but even here, it's not going to be the highest interest rates. So the highest interest rates are going to come in the 80s. Or Carter's appointment is one of the best Federal Reserve's chairman, and no, it was higher than that at the time. Okay, but I think the key here is that might be exaggerated. Ultimately, though, by the 80s, interest rates are going to reach 20% by the 80s. And this will work. This will finally stop inflation. But you guys, if you have any idea of how bad that is, current interest rate is 1 point. No. What is the current rate? 2? Is that it? 2.7? Okay, so it's a little bit higher now. I haven't had to borrow money in a long time, but 10-year fixed at 2%. So about 2%. Okay, between 2 and 3. We'll go there. 15 years. So between 2 and 3%. So imagine borrowing money at 20% interest, right? Like that's an insane amount of money that you would be paying. But that does do what to borrowing. Well, the key though is, and a lot of people, Blake included here, I think, are talking about the current 5.3 trillion or so of stimulus we've had. Man, we've had you realize all those tax cuts are stimulus we've had for the last 10 years, right? So we've had trillions of dollars since Obama's administration. I mean, he was the first to really start doing a lot of this in recent years. And interest rates from let's say from 2008 to present, right, are say 5%, 6%. They weren't high then. The thing is we've had low inflation for 25 years. So at some point you would expect with this much infusion of cash that there would be inflation, but we still don't have it. So the Fed watches inflation now like a hawk. If they see it even creeping. Now keep in mind, you can't use gas prices for inflation. That's not how inflation is measured. Because gas is not a part of the basket, they call it. You know, the Fed uses a basket of prices of stuff. So like milk, home construction costs, you know, all kinds of stuff. And if the overall rate of costs for all those start to move, then that's inflation. You know, then they're like, oh, we don't want to do that. And as soon as they do that, they nip interest rates, right? I mean, they're on it like a hawk now, and they have been, you know, for a long time as far as inflationary. Now, we haven't had inflation since the 70s and 80s. Like that was it. That's the last time we've had to deal with genuine inflation. Now, keep in mind, an increase in the monetary supply is not inherently inflationary, only if it does not have a corresponding increase in goods and services, right? Like if you just start printing money and there's not more stuff out there, then yeah, that's going to be inflationary. But this is why you guys can afford to buy a flat screen for like $250 and it's 46 inches or something stupid, right? I mean, I bought a 19-inch when I was your age in high school for $200 and some, all right? And it was picture tube, and that's not been that long ago. But I agree that all this cash pouring out into America, it could be very well inflationary because it was then without creating goods and services. The question becomes if it creates goods and services or not. In other words, if people, like for example, I read the other day, I think they've extended the unemployment benefits like September, you know, like this special unemployment. So we are reading now for the first time that people are, well, not the first time, for a while now, people are not going back to work because their unemployment relief is better than getting a job. That's terrible. And if that's the case, we don't want to do that, obviously. But this didn't work, okay? So recognize that Ford is not going to be very popular. He's got staggering inflation. His foreign policy is nothing much, but by far his most criticized action is the pardon of Nixon. Like when he does that, you know, people really are unimpressed. Okay, so your book is going to talk about a group of people who were the only sort of noted loud opponents during the 70s. In other words, the civil rights movement, I'm not going to say it dies down, but it seems to lack, without King and without Malcolm X and without sort of like noted leadership, overt leadership, there's still going to be protests, but they're not going to be like the 60s. You know, they're not going to be very large or noted. But women in the 70s are going to become much more active. And it starts out of the work of Betty Friedan. So I want you to remember her, okay? Betty Friedan was this lady in the 60s who had basically wrote the manifesto that said that suburban women felt trapped. Yeah, that's the book, The Feminine Mystique. And so think of it as like trapped in the cul-de-sac, like as a cushy prison. Because, you know, if you had a degree and you went to an Ivy League or a really good school, you were still expected to be a mom. Like that was your job. So this problem of could you be both a parent and a professional, a successful professional, was really controversial. You know, so this creates what we call second wave feminism. So be familiar with that term, second wave. This is the era of second wave feminism, okay, the 60s and 70s into the 80s. And the leading second wave feminist group is NOW. All right. So if it used to be NAWSA, NAWSA, now it's NOW, the National Organization of Women. And it was created by Betty Friedan. You know, there she was, the author. And this is Pauli Murray over here. And you can see they're advocating for better treatment for women, particularly in the workplace. So you guys familiar with the glass ceiling, the concept? All right, why is it called a glass ceiling? So I'll show you what the glass ceiling is. So, you know, glass being clear, ceiling being a place that you can't go above, right? So it's not a formal written thing, right? The glass ceiling is not official, although it was in some cases. So here you can see some sort of visual images of the glass ceiling. Okay, the idea is, and I'll type this in here. The idea is that women had huge obstacles to reach the same level as men. So, it was just sort of accepted that men would rise in industry or in commerce or in tech, education, higher ed, whatever, and that women couldn't. So there were genuine obstacles, and we call that, let me go ahead and put the text in here. Insert, yep, text box. The glass ceiling. And the pink collar ghetto. So you had this idea that women were only supposed to be, for all intents and purposes, were only supposed to be employed when they weren't parents. And if they were employed, it would be things like, like stenographers and secretaries and, any kind of low income. We call these basically, let's see here. I'll see if I can pull this up. Historically, these are the role women filled, right? However, women are saying, you know what, we'd like to do some other stuff and make a little bit more money. Thank you very much. And men were pushing back hardcore. So if you look here, you can see nursing. Right? Nursing is obviously the #1 profession. Been that way since Dorothea Dixon. And then right behind it is teaching. So, at secondary high school level, it's usually a little bit higher than, lower than 81%. Y'all see high school teachers in here? All right. Well, I know they're in here. I know, like, for example, in my field as a high school teacher, it's still overwhelmingly female. Okay. And what that lends itself to is if you compare the years of schooling, the demand, all right, and the sort of respect given, this profession should be somewhere at least with nursing or even higher up with like attorneys and things like that, right? Maybe not quite that high, but in that area. That's how they are in a lot of European countries, the profession. But because it's historically female, it's more like nurses or less. Now, today we know nurses make a lot of money, and so we're like, yay for nurses who are doing such a great job during the pandemic. But at the same time, a lot of these jobs were traditionally low pay or low wage. And so this is why they're called the pink collar, okay? Now, I would also mention, I think this is very important, there was utterly no sexual harassment policies, like anywhere. Nobody had sexual harassment law. Women were overtly discriminated against in law itself, like, sex discrimination, gender discrimination was common. And one of the things, I mentioned this the other day, but I re-mentioned it today, is the Title IX amendment. So you definitely should be familiar with Title IX because that was one of the amendments that was designed to protect women in education from discrimination. So that's still in effect today, Title IX, and definitely be familiar with that. Okay, so here's NOW, and NOW is going to have a lot of leaders, but I wanted to mention one other group who I think doesn't get much mentioning, although it was in one of our books one year. These are the ladies that actually protested the Miss America pageant. Okay, now I will point out these are the ladies, particularly that guys on the right on right-wing radio will call feminazis, and they'll use these ladies' quotes to attack the entire feminist movement. They are serious feminists. Robin Morgan was hardcore, but they were in many ways like Black Power, meaning that they overtly hated men. That's what they said. So you can see here that I feel that man hating is an honorable and viable political act. The oppressed have a right to class hatred against the class that is oppressing them. Right. So this was gender wars kind of thing, and at least for a lot of women, not nearly as many as maybe it was involved earlier in the feminist movement. But nonetheless, you can see here they're protesting the Miss America pageant, talking about sexism, right? And, attacking the idea of women's liberation. Now, it was during the 60s that women, for example, famously burned their bras, in protest of expectations on what women should look like. And they were very active in the 60s, but really by the 70s, they're going to get the major attention. And so that brings us to the sort of 4 big figures that are famous within national organization of women throughout the 70s. And so this is Gloria Steinem. She is, a very sort of liberal / progressive feminist. And she is the one who wanted to coin the term Ms., not Mrs. or Miss, but Ms. as a sort of marriage neutral / you know what I mean? Like not any sort of, not characterized based on your relationship with a man. Mr. doesn't depend on whether or not you're married or not. Well, why does a woman have that, why does she have to have a different taxonomy? So MS became Ms. Magazine, and she was the creator of Ms. Magazine, Gloria Steinem. Here you see Congresswoman Chisholm, who ran for president. This is Congresswoman Bella Abzug. She was very famous at leading women's rights activist movements. And here you see Gloria Steinem. So these were, not Betty Friedan. So these were the key ladies of NOW and a group called the National Women's Political Caucus. So they like African Americans, realized if you're going to get progress, it's probably going to either have to come through the courts or through the legal system. It ain't going to be from guys just willingly giving up power, so to speak. So these second wave feminists will push very hard for an amendment to the Constitution. It's called the Equal Rights Amendment. And it was passed in 1972. And very quickly, most of the states, 35, ratified it, turned it into law. But it didn't pass in Virginia. Virginia was one of the states that didn't pass it. And the Equal Rights Amendment is here. It reads, it has three parts, basically. Equality of rights under the law shall not be denied or abridged in the United States or any state on account of sex. All right. And then Congress can enforce it. So that's it. Your rights will not be denied based on sex. It came up 3 states short. They needed 38 states for ratification, the ERA. And President Carter and Congress even extended the time limit. It went 7 more years, right? Still didn't get those 3 states. And so it dies. The ERA goes into kind of like fail mode. And what's interesting is last year, this was 2020, Virginia voted to ratify the ERA as the 38th state. Well, Democrats wanted to make a stand, and say, hey, we're pro women. The problem is it's now, if you believe it's a problem, it's now obsolete. Like, in other words, there is no statute of limitations on an amendment. The 27th Amendment was originally proposed by by James Madison at the first Congress. Yep. And later on in history, it will be, it was ratified later, but the argument is that it's now expired, and that, so what will have to happen, at least this is what political scholars say, is that Congress will have to re-vote to affirm the amendment can be extended. In other words, like if Congress votes to say the ERA can be voted on later, i.e. now, then that would count. The other problem is, and I know this is complicated, but hey, why not? The other problem is several states have since rescinded their vote. Keep in mind, states have to pass the legislation. Like 3/4 of the state's General Assembly has to vote in favor. That's the Constitution. So if a state's General Assembly, that once passed it, later said, we want to unvote for it, they've done that. I don't remember which ones have done it. It's like 2 or 3 at least. So I think the ERA is probably not going to become an amendment. But it is interesting that it was voted on, like I said, last year. So anyway, why did the ERA fail? Extraordinarily, it failed because of a group of women. And this is when you start to really see a split in publicly grouped women from being just associated as feminists. Before this, we really didn't talk much about non-feminist women, so to speak. And this lady was a very, very savvy conservative. She was a strong Republican, and her name is Phyllis Schlafly. All right, you hear that? Phyllis Schlafly. Schlafly. She was important in state Republican fundraisers and stuff. And when she started reading the amendment, she was concerned that this would mean women would get drafted in the Army. This, by the way, doesn't talk about gender; it says sex. This means that there would be gay rights, right, which she was very much opposed to, including gay marriage, right? So Schlafly begins a stop the ERA movement. She had a button stop, and she was terrific at organizing, just as well as the ladies on the left. And many people believe that it was her leadership of this this group, STOP, which was able to halt the very quickly ratification of it. She would go from state to state. There's a really good movie with, what's her name, the actress who played Queen Elizabeth and played an elf in Lord of the Rings. Oh, who is it? I'll get to it. Kate, is it Kate? Kate Blanchett. So Kate Blanchett is in a movie on Amazon, if you guys get Amazon Prime. It's actually a mini series about Phyllis Schlafly, and it's really good. Like, you get a deep insight into her concerns. She was anti-abortion, right? So she was very much a traditional, today we would think traditional, conservative, traditionalist role of women. Now, she was criticized because her view of women seemed to be by the critics, like leave it to Beaver, kind of stay at home mom. And that obviously is not who these ladies were, right? But nonetheless, she was very active at stopping getting the ERA ratified. So I would be familiar with both her, and you'll notice that the title of her work is A Choice, Not an Echo, which is the exact same thing Barry Goldwater said when he ran for president. So she's one of the first. If you've ever watched Fox and you've seen some of these strong feminine conservatives, this is like their icon, I guess you would say, their role model. Yeah. The ladies like, what's her name? Shoot, I'm gonna draw some blanks on it. But the one that took on Trump and he talked about blood. What's her name?
Isn't she being like, aren't they trying to get rid of her?
Oh yeah, they did get rid of her, but they've gotten rid of her a few. Anyway, if you look at the time, there were very few conservative women in the public. Like, they were like wives. That's kind of what they did. So this really was a change in the kind of the sea of political affiliation. Before, the debate within women traditionally was like wanting more or even more. So think about like NALSA versus the National Women's Party and Alice Paul, right? Like, that was two groups of feminists, one wanting more than the other, so to speak. So yeah, ERA will not pass. This map is old now, but you get the idea. So I gave these the other day, and I didn't mean to early. So I thought I'd come back to them today when we talk about Reed. And I did some quick reading on Reed, and really this was a landmark ruling. This was one of the first Supreme Court rulings that created the idea of what we now call preferred position, which means if a law is going to insert gender, it better have a very good reason. In other words, that's discriminatory, probably. And so the Supreme Court is going to say, because there was a law, and I want to say it was like Idaho or somewhere out there. And what it did was, in the law, it was two parents who were divorced. They were divorced. That's why it's Reed v. Reed. And their son died. And they both wanted to have control over like estate stuff. Okay. And in the law, I think it was Idaho, but in the law, it said the male, the father, will be the one who makes the decision. And women were like, well, this lady sues because all is Supreme Court, and the court agrees that there should be no mention of gender in laws. Like, laws should not be designed for men or women. They should just be laws. They should be equal. And so this is where we get the phrase that Ruth Bader Ginsburg is famous for, on the basis of sex, which means if you discriminate on the basis of sex, you're discriminating. And this will begin the start of getting rid of gender specific laws. So in other words, laws are not the rational basis test. Like, you better have a rational reason for why you're giving separate treatment to men and women. Okay. And, today we have women in the active duty military in combat roles, and women in virtually every profession. And if you discriminate based on sex, now you can still make rules like must lift 300 pounds, right? But who knows? I mean, that might not be most of us. So the point is like the physicality requirements of the job can be specified, but not the gender of the job. So that's interesting to me. And that's Frontiero versus Richardson. If you come down here, so this is the law can't discriminate, meaning the law can't include gender. So no Reed. And then any kind of giving preferential treatment to one group or another is forbidden. And that's called strict scrutiny. Okay. So, like if you're trying to do something because it's more convenient to just say men or women, you can't do that. You can't separate. And So now today is what we call preferred positions are race. Laws can't have the word, whatever race in it. They have to be race neutral. Laws have to be gender neutral, right? And that's because, well, we're equal, at least in terms of the law. So these two cases, Reed and Frontiero, will elevate the equality that women have been actively seeking in the courtroom. Okay, and interestingly enough, Ruth Bader Ginsburg will be one of the attorneys in these cases. All right, so that's as far as women leaders. I also mentioned Roe in this section, and I've told you guys, as I've told you before. That when it comes to Roe, this was one of these principal concerns for 1970s feminists, was the freedom to have access to their own reproductive decisions. Now that, this is probably the most heated controversy in I don't know, the last 50 years, really. And I get that, particularly growing up here. But understanding constitutional law is not the same thing as understanding biblical beliefs, if that makes sense. So in other words, I grew up hearing about verses where, God knows us before we're born. And I get that. I can certainly appreciate that point of view. But I know for a fact that the ruling of the Supreme Court governs the United States. Like, that's the way it works. So regardless of what I personally believe about it, Roe is still the precedent. And the interesting thing about it is Roe will not change unless we can find a way to change Griswold. And I think a lot of people are concerned about that. Like, how do you undermine the right to privacy unless you define abortion as not a medical procedure, right? So I will say this, and again, I'm not going to give you guys any insight on my own personal views on abortion, but I've said for years, if conservatives really wanted to get rid of abortion instead of just have a wedge issue for politics, then they could simply put huge taxes on it, and that's totally constitutional, totally legal, right? But people would say, well, you can't do that because it shows that you approve of it. Oh, no, you don't. People tax stuff all the time we don't approve of. So Obama taxed what was it? Tanning booths to help pay for Obamacare, right? We pay taxes on cigarettes. Now, obviously, those are different issues than abortion, obviously, but nonetheless, it has become probably the most divisive wedge issue in modern American politics, post-race. So that's where we are today. I had a friend who was, he's kind of a Democratic guy. And I've been kind of an independent most of my adult life. But he used to say that if you want to get elected for something in Pennsylvania County, you ran on the 3 G's, right? You know what the 3 G's are? Guns, gays, and God, right? And so if you run on the 3 G's, meaning don't touch my guns, don't let gay people do anything, and God hates abortion, then you're going to get elected. Well, that's kind of true. That is the conservative point of view that emerges during this period of history. So in the 70s, lots of evangelical Christians are going to be outraged by this. They're going to be really bothered by it, as you might expect. And so that's going to create a political change in the 80s, like a dramatic political change, which we'll get to soon. Okay, here's the US v. Nixon. I mentioned that already. Okay. Let's take a look at a couple others. I talked about Milliken already, the forced busing. Keep in mind, forced busing is unconstitutional. Now, I didn't mention something that Lyndon Johnson did, and I should. Let me show you Thurgood Marshall and LBJ. So one of the most noteworthy events that President Johnson did was his appointment of Thurgood Marshall, the attorney who had been responsible for the Brown v. Board case, right? So I told you the other day, Nixon appointed several conservatives, right? But they turned out to be more like moderates, exception being Rehnquist. Well, Johnson's most liberal appointment was Thurgood Marshall. And Marshall would be a frequent opponent of several of these cases during this period. So it's interesting how you start to see a shift where Marshall will become one of the more liberal voices on the court as the court starts to evolve to be more conservative. Okay, not completely, not by any stretch, but I definitely wanted y'all to know the first African-American Supreme Court justice. Okay, and he was, I think he was brought in 60. I don't remember. I need to double check because I should know that. Off the top of my head, I don't know it. 67. So he became Associate Justice in 67. Here's the picture of the nomination. And so he was easily confirmed, and he would become our first African-American justice. So be aware that he will be involved in several of these cases, and particularly the Milliken case. He'll write a very strong, and the court was divided on Milliken. That's the, here's the dilemma. If you're an African-American, I think about this sometimes, or an American thinking about African-American, for 400 years, 370 years, you have been treated unequally. You've been treated unequally. So that means there's all these legacies of inequality. So any attempt to correct it was going to be somehow more black than white. Like you couldn't right the ship, so to speak, without giving some preferential treatment. That's why we have things like affirmative action. Like we need to start breaking through our historic injustice. The problem was many times that happened, be it affirmative action or forced busing, it was discriminatory. It discriminated against white people. And this has been one of the great failures of our country, is to heal the process of post civil rights America. Like we haven't actually got there yet. We're slow, but this is a case where, like in Milliken, they were trying to find a way to stop segregation. But you can't do it that way. It's just not. It's not constitutional to discriminate. So that's going to send a clear signal to guys like Alan Backey. Here's Alan Backey down here. Definitely know him. Alan Backey says, hey, you know what? These quotas that you have set up here at UC, and this was a medical school. So when you talk about the medical school, you're not talking about a whole lot of applicants, right? So when I talk about that schools can take race into accountability, that's like a big picture issue. But when you're talking about med school entrances, you're not talking about but a couple hundred people. So they're literally picking by hand each of those applicants. And they're rewarding on a point system more points for being black. And that just, that's not constitutional. That's discriminatory. And so between Milliken and Backey, both sent clear signals. You cannot discriminate to white people. It's called reverse discrimination. But throughout the 70s and even in the 80s, you will hear politicians and critics say, people got promoted or hired because they were black. And it's very possible. It's possibly true, but it doesn't mean it was right. It was unconstitutional then, and it's still unconstitutional. You're promoted based on your merit. That's how it's supposed to be. And unfortunately, we can't quite figure out how to do that. Okay. Another group that was dealing with terrible poverty. You guys, I don't know if you guys know this or not, but the leading location in America for poverty, like the highest rate of poverty, is not Southside Chicago or outer Detroit. It's the Native American reservation. So the reservations had the worst case of alcoholism, worst case of poverty, and the federal government was doing nothing really to deal with that on a large scale. And so you had the militarization, the militancy of the Native American movement. So you should know AIM, AIM, the American Indian Movement. Okay, and they physically held a armed standoff. You can see the guns in this picture at Wounded Knee, and they occupied the island of Alcatraz. Now, it was no longer a functioning prison at that point, but these are occupations, we call them. And they were meant to raise attention, and they certainly did. But, the plight of the Native American is not really much different today than it was 40 years ago for most Native Americans. A handful have been recognized by the federal government. So I would tell you that the place that's seen the most progress for Indians is Oklahoma in the last 5 years. You guys see the Supreme Court ruling on Oklahoma? So the nature of these changes are changing, so to speak. But I wanted y'all to see Oklahoma post-court ruling. So the Supreme Court in, I forget what year this was, 2019, 2020, 2019, issued on a lawsuit. There was a lawsuit by this group, the Muscogee Creek Nation. And Muscogee, so this is real recent, y'all. This is like current events. But nonetheless, 2019, they ruled that these reservations, right? Cherokee, these are the organized tribes. You remember those guys? All right. Cherokee, Creek, Choctaw, they were never disestablished. Therefore, this part of Oklahoma is Indian territory today. The court ruled half of Oklahoma is now Native American territory because they were never disestablished as the Great Indian Reservation. So that's crazy, right? Like to think about. I mean, there's a lot of people that live in, well, not a lot, but it's Oklahoma after all. But you'll notice that's Tulsa. So Tulsa is in this area. So I guess if you want to talk about the tide has turned for the Native Americans, it doesn't get more clear than this. The Supreme Court basically, orders that half of Oklahoma is now part of the Native Americans' land, and that's I don't know if that's good or bad. Obviously, if you're in Oklahoma, it would be a pretty radical moment. So be familiar with that, and not necessarily with the Oklahoma case, but the fact that after the 70s, AIM does get some kind of vocal attention. Okay, not as much as we would like, but I think the book talks about that victory right there that I showed you was not for AIM. That victory is for that specific Native tribe, but I guess many of you would see that as a victory. Certainly. What did they say? Yeah, here it is. US v. Wheeler. That was the case I wanted to pull out. US v. Wheeler. So US v. Wheeler, I'll pull that out, show you to you. In the case of US v. Wheeler, the court ruled that the states have no authority at all over over the rights of the people who live there. Okay, so they are only subject. I'll pull this off. That's good. But in this case, they are only subject to the U.S. Congress's action, and not to any individual state. So, by the way, that does bring back the tribal identity that Eisenhower had eliminated, and Johnson had kind of started restoring. So by the 1970s, if you're familiar with Indians today, like at all, you'll know that America has gone through a sort of, I guess you might say, an apologetic phase where Native Americans have been much more recognized for their historic contribution and not simply as like the Redskins or the savages as they once were described by public sentiment. Now, guys, I will tell you this. Many people look at things like this and this as politically correct, right? Like this is the kind of stuff that right now, a lot of people are like, oh, this is terrible. How can they do this? It's a white person's country, right? Well, the problem is that everyone, if they're going to be treated equally, that means you have to stop discriminating. All right. I don't want anybody to get extra favorite treatment or special treatment, but I want people who aren't getting equal treatment to not be like that. So, calling something political correct is easy if you're the people in power. If it's your team winning, the whole idea of protest is that things are not correct, that things are not fair or true or just. And so I believe in justice. I don't worry about that much about politically correctness or not. So, anywho, that's it for today. Tomorrow we will take up Jimmy Carter, and not tomorrow, Thursday we will take up Jimmy Carter, and then we'll move on Friday into Ronald Reagan and the 80s. And really, that's not the end of history, but it's almost the end of this class's history. Okay, so I'll stop with that and see if anybody's got any questions they need to deliberate. Hey, y'all.